the seizure of the US embassy in Tehran by the Iranian Islamic Revolutionaries, and the hostage-taking of more than 50 US diplomats for 444 days and nights in 1979-1980 to humiliate the US superpower, shocked the world. At that time, the US had a daring plan to rescue the hostages, but it failed miserably from the start and left a stain and hatred. Now, superstar George Clooney is planning to make a film about this event. However, Hollywood has been unfair in not mentioning the role of the Germans in the hostage crisis at that time, a role that until now very few people know about. Germany's role at that time can partly explain Germany's role today in the nuclear crisis with Iran, before the sun rose like a fireball. Over the Gulf of Oman, 8 American CH-53 helicopters lifted off from the USS Nimitz and headed north. Their target was the Dasht-e Salt Desert in Iran, a 6-hour flight away, one of the most desolate places on Earth. There, a team of a few dozen elite American soldiers waited in the pitch-black night. They had been airlifted there in day advance. It was April 25th, 1980, and if Operation Eagle Claw had been successful that day, the Americans could now boast about perhaps the most remarkable hostage rescue in world history. Because according to the plan, the commando team would break into Tehran and rescue more than 50 diplomats, staff, and Marines who had been held hostage for months by followers of Ayatollah Khomeini, the new power in Iran after the Shah was overthrown in January 1979 in the Islamic Revolution. His followers stormed the US embassy in Tehran on November 4, 1979, and took hostages in order to force the US to extradite the Shah, who had fled to the US back to Iran. The daring plan was for US soldiers to suddenly land in Tehran, retrieve the hostages being held in the embassy, and use helicopters to take them from an airport on the outskirts of Tehran to a safe place controlled by the US. But the commandos never reached the capital Tehran, as a sandstorm forced one of the helicopters to turn back en route to the Salt Desert and another to make an emergency landing. When a third helicopter had to abandon its mission due to a hydraulic problem, US President Jimmy Carter had to call off the daring operation, as the military needed at least 6 aircraft for the rescue plan. That alone was a failure. But the operation turned into a disaster when on the way back, a helicopter and one of the transport planes collided and both burned. 8 soldiers died, 12 others were injured. The next day, photos of the charred remains of the planes in the Persian desert were broadcast around the world, symbolizing the unprecedented humiliation of the American superpower by radical Islamists. Carter now had to negotiate with them, and it was not until January 1981 that the hostages were released. To this day, many Americans still regard the hostage crisis as a symbol of the war of cultures. It marked the beginning of the long-standing hostility between Washington and the Islamic regime in Tehran. The hostage-taking and failed rescue attempt cost Jimmy Carter his presidency in November 1980, and Ronald Reagan was elected to replace him. When the new government in Tehran wanted to send a letter to the recently deposed Shah Pahlavi, they asked the Bonn government for help. Norbert Montfort, an Iran expert in the German Foreign Ministry, acted as an emissary and delivered a sealed letter to a military hospital in Texas where Pahlavi was being treated. As Mr. Montfort now recounts, Mr. Pahlavi refused to accept the letter, and it was returned to Tehran intact, and Ambassador Gerhard Ritzel gave it back to the Tehran government. Ritzel was the only Western ambassador in the Iranian capital who had close ties to the Iranian Revolutionary Council. Ayatollah Khomeini held the diplomat in high regard, as he had warned the Islamic regime against a hit squad sent to Iran, including a German. The hit squad was tasked by the former Shah Pahlavi to assassinate Khomeini. Ritzel's warning prevented the assassination. Therefore, German Ambassador Ritzel was chosen to act as a mediator between the Iranians and the Americans during the hostage crisis. Thanks to Ritzel, important American messages were delivered to the appropriate addresses in Tehran. The German Foreign Office often passed his reports and assessments to the U.S. State Department. Even then, U.S. Secretary of State Edmund Muskie personally met with Ritzel to be briefed and assess the situation. There were even secret negotiations between Iran and the United States about the release of the hostages in Bonn at Tehran's request, in the German Foreign Ministry's guest house on Mount Venusberg. The Germans brokered the deal not only to help the hostages. They also wanted to make up for the German government's persistent refusal to accept President Carter's demands that its allies impose economic sanctions on Iran. He first targeted the Bonn coalition led by Chancellor Helmut Schmidt because no Western European government had as many trade relations with the Islamic regime in Tehran as the Federal Republic of Germany. But it was precisely because of these trade relations that Chancellor Schmidt did not want to listen to the American demands. Carter's staff commented that there was only one reason that could have motivated Schmidt to act: the fear that the United States might attack Iran. According to Hamilton Jordan, an advisor to President Carter in the winter of 1979 to 1980, the Carter administration tried to intimidate the Bonn government by declaring that Washington would take other measures against Tehran if Bonn did not impose sanctions. Chancellor Schmidt had long considered Carter foolish and incompetent, and immediately believed that Washington wanted to attack Iran. Chancellor Schmidt was annoyed and commented that the U.S. had acted in a stupid and rash manner. Chancellor Schmidt repeatedly compared the world political situation in early 1980 to the hot summer of 1914 when World War I broke out. But when on April 12 and 13, 1980, the leaders of the ruling coalition in Bonn agreed to comply with the U.S. sanctions, at least in part, other European countries refused. What the Bonn government did not know was that Carter had decided the day before to abandon the sanctions path. The U.S. president no longer believed that the Allies would impose effective sanctions against Tehran and bet on a risky rescue. Of course, Carter had only informed the British about this adventurous decision, so the Bonn government only learned about the Eagle Claw operation after it had failed the next day, again from the radio, which naturally angered the German government. The German government had repeatedly warned against such a commando operation. The German Border Service's counter-terrorism team had reenacted the hostage-taking as part of their training program and had come to the conclusion that a rescue operation had only a chance of success in the first 2 weeks. In the Tehran hostage drama, Schmidt was fortunate not to be put to such a test again. The kidnappers had spread the hostages out, ruling out a new rescue operation. Carter was ultimately forced to rely on negotiations with Tehran, thus following a path that the Germans had advocated from the start. The American hostages eventually returned home safely, but only after a total of 444 days of tension and fear. The hostage crisis ended, but Washington's hostility toward Tehran continues to this day, and the German government still has a distinct role to play in relations with Iran.